Well, I want to start in a little bit of an unusual place this week, the Proverbs 31 woman. The 10th verse of that passage begins with this phrase, a wife of noble character who can find. Now, lots of people think that this section is a list of what we as wives should do, a list of chores, and it's a pretty daunting one if that's what it is. How many of us can live up to that? I don't think she ever slept, that woman. But that's really not what this passage is about. Proverbs is about wisdom, and wisdom throughout the book is personified as a woman. Chapter 31 is how wisdom looks when it's lived. How does our character project the wisdom of God into our actions? It's more about the character that shows in our behaviors, in the behaviors of our lives, than it is a checklist of chores for women. So in fact, the teachings of the chapter are as much for men as they are for women, which is a relief for all of us who thought, oh boy, I'm failing as a wife. Now, the reason I'm starting in Proverbs 31 is that this woman is called a wife of noble character. And that phrase, noble character, is used very few places in the Old Testament of a person, and one place is in the book of Ruth. And so for that reason, I'm going to jump ahead for just a second to Ruth chapter 3. In verse 11 of that chapter, Boaz says to Ruth, we all know you are a woman of noble character. Now, Ruth is not a wife or a mother. She doesn't have servants to order around or to provide for or to cook for. She doesn't have a vineyard to plant or fields to sell. She is not in the same life situation as the woman in Proverbs 31. So if this is simply a list of requirements for a wife, Ruth shouldn't be called that because she is not a wife at this point in time. But she is called that because she has the same character as the woman in Proverbs 31. And character is the primary subject of Ruth chapter 2. Now, we might need some air quotes in this chapter. Things just happen. And we might also need one of those clouds with a light bulb in it, because is like you see in cartoon drawings, because there is a bit of a light bulb moment. God is really at work in chapter 2. Ruth doesn't see it, and no one yet has any idea of exactly what God's going to do, but Naomi is starting to get a tiny little glimmer of a hint. The chapter begins with a bit of information. Naomi has a relative of her husband whose name is Boaz, and he lives locally. Verse chapter 2 tells us why Ruth came to Bethlehem with Naomi and shows us what their financial situation is like. They have to glean in the fields to eat. They can't go and buy food. They are the poorest of the poor. And Ruth says to Naomi, let me go out and glean, picking up the leftover grain in the fields of anyone who is favorable towards me. Ruth has come with Naomi just for this purpose, to do the backbreaking work of providing for Naomi's needs. She wants to take care of her. She has a generous heart. Now, this practice of gleaning has its roots in the Old Testament law. Leviticus 19, 9-10 says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. That means the bits that are left behind. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. The poor had a really rough time of it in the ancient world. There is no social assistance, no welfare. So this practice of allowing the poor and the alien to glean in the fields was commanded by God as a way for the poor to be supplied with food. You were not to reap to the edges of your field for every last bit. You were not to go over it a second time for what you missed. If you dropped pieces of grain or bunches of grapes, you had to leave them lie there for the poor. But not everyone followed this command. Not everyone was willing to allow the poor to glean in their fields. God commanded it, but not everybody did it. So Ruth needs a place where someone will be favorable towards her. And Naomi tells her to go. And so out she goes and begins to glean. Verse 3, in the middle of the verse, it says, as it turned out. And this is where you need some air quotes. It just so happened. Not. I think the author has a tongue-in-cheek moment when he says it just so happened, or it just turned out this way, because this is one place where God is moving. The author knows this, for he has taken the time to tell us already that Boaz is a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. God directed Ruth in some way to Boaz's field, although Ruth was entirely unaware of that. Now, I don't know what you discerned about Boaz from this chapter, but he is a God-fearing man. He is also highly respected. His foreman respects him and knows him well enough to know that he would allow the poor to glean in his field. The foreman would not have allowed Ruth to do that if his master wasn't willing to do so, because he's basically giving away his master's grain. So he had to have known that Boaz was the kind of man who would allow the poor to do this. He's a generous man, although his generosity may not be as visible to us on a first read of chapter 2 as it would be if we had a good grasp of the culture. So Ruth is working away and has been there for some hours when Boaz shows up to check on his harvest. Now, Bethlehem is not a big town. It's very, very tiny, in fact. And he sees Ruth and he immediately knows that he doesn't know her. She's not one of his servants, and he doesn't recognize her from this little bitty community where they live. And he asks his foreman who she is. And the foreman says, she's the Moabitess. This is the second time already in this chapter where Ruth's origins are mentioned. The first time is back in verse 2, where it says, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi. And then the foreman identifies her as being from Moab too, but he has a lot of good things to say about her. He said that she asked if she could glean. She didn't just walk in and start. She asked, she requested the freedom to do this, and then she worked really hard all morning with only a very short rest break. Now, Boaz has heard of Ruth, and so he goes over to talk to her. He calls her daughter, and he tells her not to go into another field, but to stay by his servant girls and follow them. In the ancient world, fields and land boundaries were marked by what they called boundary stones, which were stones not set really close together, but set spaced out along the edge of a field to mark the edges of one guy's property to another. But they could be very hard to see. If their crops have grown right up to the edge of them, if there's weeds growing around them, you might miss the boundary stones. And if both fields, one on one guy's property and one on the other, were both growing barley at the same time, it would be very easy to wander accidentally across the boundary line and into someone else's land. If Ruth did that, she might wander onto the property of someone who would not be kind toward her, or who may even have evil intentions toward an unprotected young woman. And so his instruction to stay by his servant girls is so that she'll stay in his fields and be safe from the neighbors. Now, the other thing that he does when it comes time another thing that he says is he commands his men to leave her alone, and then he says she may drink from the water jugs that the men have filled. This doesn't sound like a lot to us. We're used to going and getting a drink of water very easily whenever we want it, but there was no water source in the fields unless the worker brought their own or the master provided it. And clearly Boaz has provided it. For the master to provide it required a fairly significant amount of work. These big stone water jugs had to be hauled out to the field by the workers, and then water had to be hauled from the town well and poured into the water jugs in order for Boaz's workers to have water to drink while they worked. So for him to allow someone who is basically freeloading and taking his grain already to also partake of his hard effort on behalf of his servants by drinking the water is a really huge act of kindness. But it saves her a lot of time. If she had had to walk every time she was overwhelmed with thirst back to town, get a drink from the well, and come back, it would have lost her a significant amount of time working. Ruth recognizes how kind Boaz is being to her, and she bows down. She asks him why he has shown her such favor, being she is a foreigner. And this is the third reference to Ruth's foreignness, and she mentions it herself here in this passage. She calls herself a foreigner. In verse 11, Boaz begins to say what he has heard of Ruth, and he emphasized her kindness to Naomi that had made him show her kindness. He says that he has heard what she has done for Naomi and ties that back to the fact that she left her home and came to live in Bethlehem. Now, it doesn't say directly, but I think we can infer that Ruth had come with the purpose of caring for Naomi. She came to help her to do this hard work and to care for her mother-in-law. She's not expecting to get anything for herself out of this. Boaz knows that, and he's impressed. Boaz has seen the character of Ruth, even though she just arrived in town, and he's very complimentary. Verse 13 made me laugh a little bit. Boaz says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. This, in essence, is a prayer for Ruth. And God's going to answer it, but he's going to use Boaz to answer Boaz's prayer, and he doesn't even know it yet. I think this is one of the truths about how God blesses and guides us that we can learn from this book. When God lays on our hearts about something or some person, something that we think we would like to see God do, often God is going to make us a part of the answer to that prayer. If something is on your heart or some ministry you would like to see happen, someone that you would like God to bless in a specific way, you might want to ask God how he intends for you to be a part of that. Often he lays it on our hearts, not just so we'll pray about it, but so that we'll be part of his answer to the need. Boaz was Ruth's answer. Sometimes we get an idea for a ministry and we say the church should do this and this and this. No, very possibly you should. So Ruth is grateful for the kindness of Boaz, and he's not done showing kindness to her on this day. As lunch comes, he invites her over to eat with his servants. And when she sits down, he gives her some roasted grain. This would have been either food that he brought to provide for his workers, or it would have been his own lunch. And she gets to eat all that she wants, and she has some left over which she is allowed to take with her. It seems to imply that she didn't have any food with her. It might have been that the grain that she is gathering was going to be made into a cake that night that would be the first food of the day for herself and Naomi. When she goes back to work, Boaz gives orders to his workers that they are to let her go wherever she wishes to glean. Now, the Old Testament law required that she be allowed to glean along the edges and in the corners of the field, but Boaz is saying, let her go wherever she wants. If she goes among the standing sheaves of harvested grain, let her go there. Don't embarrass her. In fact, he says, drop extra for her to find. Make it easy for her to get a lot. Then it says that Ruth worked until evening, and then she threshed the grain. Now, threshing is the beating of the heads of the grain onto a hard-packed earth called a threshing floor to get the grain out of the stalks. She then gathered it up and took it home with her. And verse 17 said that she had about an ephah. Now, I have a footnote in my Bible, and I know a couple of you had noticed this as well. It kind of blew my mind. It said that she had 3/5 of a bushel, or about 22 liters of grain. 22 liters. When you think about this, she gathered this 1 or 2 stalks at a time. That is a huge amount of work, long hours of bending and picking up bit by bit, and then more time banging that all on the ground to get those little tiny kernels of barley out of the end of it, and then gather it up and end up with 22 liters. It gave me 2 pictures. One is a picture of the amount of sheer hard work that this was. And the other is the grace that is shown Ruth for the amount that was left for her to find. Naomi is blown away by the amount of grain that Ruth brought home. Ruth also gives to Naomi the leftover roasted grain that she had eaten for lunch. And Naomi asks where she had gone to glean and blesses this unknown person who took notice of Ruth. And Ruth says it was the field of a man named Boaz. Now, I think if this story was portrayed as one of those cartoon drawings, this was where you would need the cloud above the head and the little light bulb going off over Naomi's head. She begins to think of some possibilities at this point. The first thing that Naomi says is to ask a blessing on Boaz. She is beginning to realize that God has not abandoned her. She is losing her bitterness, beginning to see God's kindness. And then the second thing she does is to pray. She praises God for the kindness he has shown them. She sees his care in the events of the day. And she makes a comment about how the wheels are turning in her head. Now, before we move on to what she said, kindness in this verse is the Old Testament word hesed, the Hebrew word hesed. And when it refers to a person's kindness, it usually has something to do with their mercy or generosity. But when it refers to God's kindness, God's hesed, it's his covenantal love, the love that he promised and that he fulfills because of his covenant with Israel. It's his faithful love. And Boaz here is kind of being pictured as portraying some of God's covenant love in his kindness toward Ruth, his hesed. In the last part of verse 20, Naomi goes on to make a comment about what she's thinking, and she says, this man is our close relative, and he's one of our kinsman redeemers. The NIV says kinsman redeemer. Not all versions do, but that's the idea of this. I want to stop a minute here and explain what a kinsman redeemer is and what qualifies a person to be one. I know some of the groups we talked about this, but not everybody who watches this would have been in our discussion. Leviticus 25, verses 27 and 49 tell us a bit about the process of redeeming land or people. If a person had debts that they could not pay, they might have to sell their land to pay their debts. If they were really destitute and they had no land or other assets, they might even have to sell themselves as a slave in order to have enough money to pay what they owed. The person that is sold themselves as a slave or the land that is sold can be redeemed. That means it can be bought back. And there are 3 qualifications of the one who redeems either the person or the land. And these are all found, well, 2 of them are found in the verses in Leviticus, and one of them is implied. So first, the person has to be a relative, and that's stated in the verses. They can be any kind of a relative, but they have to be a relative of the person that they are redeeming. Secondly, the person has to have the means to pay the price to buy the land or the person back. And that's implied. I mean, you can't expect someone to sell themselves as a slave in order to buy someone else back. That's not realistic. And so the person has to have the means to pay the price. And then the third thing is it says in those Levitical verses that the person may do this if they wish. The kinsman redeemer had to be willing. They could not be forced to redeem. It was a voluntary thing. Because of the fact that the one who does the redeeming is a relative, this process of redeeming land or people became known as the kinsman redeemer. It was an act of kindness and generosity on the part of one who does the redeeming. They get nothing out of it themselves. The redeemer would pay to buy back the land or buy back the slave. If they bought back the slave, they would set them free. If they bought back the land, they would give it back to the original owner, and they would get not a penny of the money in return. So they are paying a fair amount just out of generosity and kindness. The redeemer gets nothing. It's an act of grace to redeem. Naomi has realized that this man Boaz was not only a relative, but one who was qualified to be a kinsman redeemer, at least in that he's closely related to her and that he obviously has the wealth to pay the price. What she doesn't yet know is if he's going to be willing to redeem. But his kindness to Ruth on this day makes her think that just perhaps he might be. I think Naomi had a light bulb moment here, and the wheels began to turn. And so she encourages Ruth to continue to glean in the fields of Boaz, because he will keep her safe. Chapter 2 ends with a verse of general information that we often pass very quickly over. It says, "So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests are finished, and lived with her mother-in-law." Now, God's been working behind the scenes in Ruth's life. God is moving. We can see it, and Naomi seems to see a little bit of a glimmer of it, but Ruth does not yet know. It might seem as if, since God has begun to work, that Ruth and Naomi would be rescued immediately from grinding poverty. But no. Ruth goes back to backbreaking work day in and day out for weeks, all through the barley harvest and all through the wheat harvest. God does not jump in and rescue them right away. He's working, but it's not at supersonic speed. I think that God left this time for Ruth to demonstrate the depths of her character by her consistent hard work on behalf of her mother-in-law. Her faithfulness to what she felt called to do for Naomi is clearly shown through the weeks of hard labor. So one of the lessons of this chapter is about how God blesses. He often requires us to be faithful where we are put before he blesses us with better things or calls us into a greater area of ministry. God very much values our faithfulness and our character, and Ruth shows it in spades. She is expecting years of this sort of grinding toil, but she's not backing down from it at all. She just jumps right in and goes to work and does the hard stuff, providing for Naomi day in and day out with no end in sight that she can see. God requires this time of faithfulness from her before he steps in and does even more for her. It should make us evaluate where God has put us to be faithful in less than ideal circumstances. How are you doing in that? Maybe it's a difficult marriage. Maybe it's a long, hard slog with a family situation or a relationship that's just not working out, or a ministry that you felt called to do and it's just not showing fruit, or you felt that you wanted to do something, you felt called by God to do something in some particular area, and he's just not got you there yet, and you're wondering if and when it's ever going to happen. If we kick against the circumstances, instead of buckling down and doing the hard work where God has us in the moment, why should he call us forward into blessing or a greater ministry? In addition, while outward circumstances may not change for quite a while, God is still at work. He's at work in our hearts. And this is his primary interest. And sometimes troubling times externally, in external circumstances, make for massive progress in our godliness and character development. We sometimes wish God would focus on changing our external circumstances, but God is far more interested in our character. Character really shows up in this chapter. Ruth had steadfast commitment, integrity to what she's felt called to do, and faithfulness in the hard slog. And God is going to honor that. Boaz had kindness and generosity. He has a perception to see how kind Ruth is and to pray that God will bless her, not knowing that he's going to be the answer to that prayer. Both of them show what chapter 3 calls noble character. God is going to give both of them great gifts in the upcoming days. Their lifestyles of patient and consistent goodness, doing what is right in God's eyes, doing what they felt called to do, is an example for us of how to live our lives. No matter if we are like Boaz, living in wealth, or like Ruth, living in poverty, there is a place for good character. And there are times when we have to persevere with less than what we would like. Boaz chose to be generous, to do what the law said and allow the poor to glean in his fields. He chose to go further and actively help Ruth gather lots of grain. Ruth is plodding faithfully along in the hard work she's been called to do, and she's doing it with a great attitude and with awe at the kindness being shown to her. She is appreciative of the generosity of others. 3 times in chapter 2, Ruth is called the Moabitess, and once she calls herself a foreigner. You can check it out in verses 2, 6, 10, and 21. Yet this foreigner who has come to trust in God is exhibiting godly character. There is no one from any background that God can't change into his character. She's showing godliness in spite of her pagan background. And in spite of her foreignness, God is showing her grace, even while she does backbreaking work. God is moving, and he's going to change circumstances, but first he's refining character. How is he refining yours today? And where is he working to change you so you will be ready for greater things?